Looking at investment and financing activities, I think trade data is much more readily available when you look at the trading relationship between China and Africa. I've been asked many questions around disaggregated data of Chinese outward FDI. The one source that the Chinese Ministry of Commerce publishes together with the National Bureau of Statistics, as well as SAFE, the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, is the Outward FDI Bulletin. And as you can see here, particularly since this one only from 2003, but it's specifically from 1985 that Chinese overseas investment came about. Particularly state-owned enterprises were designated and supported by the state to go global, to increase their competitiveness internationally, and to basically create national champions. According to this bulletin, more than 5,000 domestic Chinese investment entities had by the end of 2009 established over 10,000 overseas enterprises in 170 countries. And you can see that 2 years later, this increased to 8,500 Chinese investment entities, establishing more than 12,000 overseas enterprises. So what is the trend for Africa? Let me just see, there's a slide missing here in between. All right. The slide that's missing is the slide that actually shows the distribution of FDI, Chinese FDI by region. FDI is highly skewed towards Asia, Chinese outward FDI. It used to be the second largest region used to be Latin America. This has now changed since last year. Africa has overtaken Latin America, largely due to the ICBC Standard Bank deal. As you can see, investment has come from a low base to Africa, and it's been growing exponentially in the last year or two. Just to show you the growth between 2003 and 2008, Africa does not receive the most Chinese FDI, but it's definitely been the highest, has seen the highest growth in FDI. I think one of the things that's often debated is how many Chinese companies are there in Africa, and there have been lots of estimates going around. About 5 years ago it was 600, 2 years ago it was about 800, now the estimates are around 2,000, but I don't think anybody really knows. Particularly when it comes to what Victor mentioned, the smaller private enterprises that consist out of entrepreneurs, handful of people, seeing the opportunities in the African continent, the niche. I can name a couple of examples, particularly also relating to Zimbabwe, for example. I'm not going to take too much time on this, but I think what we've been seeing is that FDI is still largely skewed towards the extractive industries, but over the last 2 to 3 years, particularly since FOCAC 2009 last year, we're going to be seeing a greater diversification across sectors. It's been estimated that cumulative investments are at about $13.5 billion US, but these figures vary. Investments and inroads of Chinese companies are supported by the Chinese government, as Victor mentioned, as well as the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Commitments, which effectively lay out 3-year roadmaps for Chinese inroads into the continent. Then you have FDI, you have the different types of financing, debt financing, equity financing, and I'll go into them in a second. Victor, I feel like I'm repeating everything you're saying. So just to give you the basics of the major banks in Africa, China only is still making progress in its own financial sector liberalization. In 1994, 3 policy banks were created that fulfilled the role of 4 commercial banks that were created, I think, in the late 80s, but that didn't actually focus on the government's development objectives as planned. Those policy banks are China Exim Bank, China Development Bank, as well as the Agricultural Development Bank of China. And it's especially China Exim Bank and CDB that are active in the continent. China Exim Bank is also the government's arm for concessional loans to Africa, which make a great share of its activities in the continent. Out of CDB, the CAD fund has been spun, the China-Africa Development Fund. It was announced in 2006 at FOCAC, and it's an equity fund, the first of its kind, in China that looks at investments in Africa. Capitalized by CDB, it started off as $1 billion, and it's going to be a fund of about $5 billion. It focuses on agriculture, power, infrastructure, mining, and special economic zones investments. We, as Frontier Advisory, assisted the fund to open its offices in South Africa in 2009 March, and it's also opened an office in Addis Ababa. The fund has enormous amounts of projects on its books. Anybody that's got some sort of mining right somewhere has approached the fund. They're highly understaffed, far too much on their books. And one of the biggest mining investments that we've also been advising on in South Africa is actually a platinum deal that the fund is involved in. Other activities, China Construction Bank has an office in South Africa, is very much involved in trade financing, as well as the Bank of China, and already mentioned the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. There's also other sources of financing, but you'll find this in my presentation. It's also been mentioned, the infrastructure and construction sector and the activities. I think it's a key commercial opportunity that, as was mentioned, has been neglected by other donors, by other investors. The World Bank has estimated a $93 billion infrastructure financing and maintenance gap, and I think financing from wherever it might be is definitely welcome. The IMF estimated that China Exim Bank alone funded more than the aggregate investment of all ODA inflows and private participation in infrastructure in Africa's power sector. I'm not going to go too much into anything further. I've been given 2 minutes, but I do want to talk about some of the future sectors of investment. And this is in line with the roadmaps that have been announced at the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation. I think some of the key sectors, and some of this also obviously in line with African countries' development objectives, are agriculture, and particularly the agro-processing industry. We look at Nigeria and Angola, known for their oil countries that are oil producers, but both of them have re-emphasized the interests in the agricultural sector. In line with this, China extended a $1 billion agricultural loan to Angola a year and a bit ago. Manufacturing, obviously the anti-Chinese sentiment that's coming out of a number of African countries in terms of manufactured goods coming in from China, destroying the small manufacturing base, particularly in clothing and textiles. Here we're seeing, coupled with special economic zones that have been announced across the continent, interest from Chinese companies to build some sort of value-add capacity in a number of countries. For example, in Zambia, around the copper industry in Chambishi. I think the extractive industries will definitely be part of the future investment profile, but special economic zones, manufacturing, agriculture, but also supporting infrastructure for private sector to do business and to be able to do business, not only African private sector, but also Chinese investors coming in, including ICT, transport networks, and so forth. And linked to the special economic zones, as I mentioned in Zambia, beneficiation activities. One of the CAD fund projects that are being evaluated at the moment in South Africa is a diamond polishing project. I think I'll leave it at that. Please feel free to view my presentation. Thank you.